Hello, everybody. Welcome again to our Bible study. Last week we talked about the garden. We looked at the garden as in the text, the way it's described. We thought of it as a geographical place and people's efforts to locate the garden. And we also talked about the garden as a metaphor, both in terms of the ways that people have thought about it in the past. We talked about, for instance, what was referred to as the Black Eden in Idlewild, Michigan, this kind of mecca for Black cultural and intellectual and also just leisure realities. And then we talked about it also as a metaphor for the future, a kind of utopia. And we looked at the Eden Project in the UK, which is a series of biodomes that are creating various ecosystems on the planet with the efforts to help people reconnect with nature. Today, we're going to look at the fall. And so, by way of entry into that conversation, I'm just going to open it up first with some discussion. What were you taught, if anything, about what the fall was?
There was a lot of shame around.
There's a lot of shame. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Standard apple,
The,
we now know wasn't there.
yes. So what's centered?
Being fed by Adam to, by Eve.
Yes. So those pieces of the story, in particular, of the fall being about eating an apple, which we've discussed actually was not probably an apple in the imaginations of the people who wrote this, but and then also how it was Eve who gave that fruit to Adam. Okay, that Eve was a temptress, and that this was about disobedience. Yeah, that was the fall, disobedience. Okay. Anything else, folks? Kind of remember what you were taught about the fall.
Rejection.
Kind of rejection is what followed that disobedience. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's take a look at what the text says. So, if you have your copy, then feel free to read along. You can also find it in on the internet or in an actual Bible. Uh, and if you don't have any of those, I will just read it out to you. So we're in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. Now, the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. The serpent said to the woman, "Did God say you shall not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves." Let's pause there just for now. Okay. What sticks out to you in that reading? Any particular phrases or words or scenes?
You shall not surely die. That got me. Why do they use the word surely? S-U-R-L-Y.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and then so in this translation, in verse 4, Fran was saying the word surely is used there. The serpent says, "You will surely not die." In this translation, it just says, "You will not die." But nevertheless, that's the way the serpent convinces them, right? You're not going to die if you eat this.
You really aren't.
You really aren't. Yeah. And that seems to be all that it really took. Because Eve, noticing that it was good for food, it says, went ahead and ate it. All right. Anything else you notice about what it says?
Serpent being so crafty. I mean, God has made everything, right? So therefore, God has put this serpent in making crafty.
Yeah. Yeah.
It didn't seem to take much for them to be convinced. You know? You would have thought it might take a lot. Because it was just a statement. So what's that say about them and the power of the serpent?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this wasn't a very long exchange. It was just God said that we shouldn't eat it because we'll die, and the serpent says, "No, you won't." And then Eve says, "Okay." And then she eats it, and then she gives it to Adam, and then he just eats it. So it all seems pretty simple, actually. Yeah, so what does that say about what's
Transactional.
happening? Yeah.
The other thing about this is I didn't think about this at a time, so I didn't try to find the answer. But do they know what death is at this point? I mean, what does it mean? Oh, you won't die. Well, they didn't ask him questions about what does that mean.
Right.
They just said, oh, I think we'll have our eyes will be open. And the first thing they become aware of is their own physical nakedness.
Yes.
What else goes with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, people have written and thought a lot about that question about death. Was there even death at all before this? And then there's also the question of time, because it's possible that there's a little bit of a language thing happening here, where the sense that Eve maybe was saying this was that if we eat it, we'll instantly die. And then the serpent is saying, you won't instantly die. But what ultimately happens is the way this story goes is that death was introduced into creation because of this. And so there's a timing thing, immediately or eventually, kind of a situation. Yeah. And then, of course, there's the question of what. Yeah.
And the serpent essentially is the devil.
We're going to get to that because that's one of the things we're talking now about what it does say. And in just a moment, I'm going to ask you about what it doesn't say. And one of the things that this does not say is Satan or devil. So that's, yeah. But what were you thinking though, Carl?
Well, I was just the whole idea of when man said that God created everything.
Hmm.
Did God create this concept of death? I mean, the devil or evil?
Yeah. Yeah,
Was that already in the world?
yeah, it's a really good question. The question being, God created everything. Pan was naming God created the serpent. So by extension, does that mean God also created evil? God created disobedience or the capacity for disobedience? Yeah. Marcia, what were you thinking about?
I mean, they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then they discovered themselves to be naked. Is there an implication that nakedness is evil? Is that what that means?
Yeah, it's a great question. It certainly seems that way, doesn't it? Because they were ashamed immediately. And so, one of the things that we talked about in one of our earlier sessions was how origin stories, part of what they can do is help people have a reason for their own cultural norms. And so, if we think about perhaps what's happening here, in one sense, is a justification for the shame around nakedness. That's one way we could read this. Another way that folks have read this is that, in fact, what is happening here is that Adam and Eve, before eating the fruit, were children, and then after the eating of the fruit, they mature into adulthood. And so what happens is that what we're seeing is sort of a developmental journey, is another way people have read this, into a kind of shame. But that still doesn't answer the question of why would being naked be bad? And also, um, what did they cover when they sowed the fig leaves? Right? If we look around the world, not everyone thinks that everything that is exposed is necessarily bad. And so this is a long way of saying, I don't have an answer for you, but it is interesting to think about that being the very first thing that when their eyes are opened, they were aware of suddenly. Hey, John, welcome.
I've got a question, and it says, we worship one God, but as you read verse 5, for God don't know that in the day you eat thereof, your eyes shall be open, and ye shall be as gods. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what gods are we worshiping?
Yeah.
I'm speaking of the Christian God, G-O-D, capitalization.
Yeah.
But then here they have the small G-O-D-S.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, okay, here we go again. What gods?
Yeah. Yeah, so Fran's naming how in verse 5, and I'm guessing that's the King James version.
I think so.
Well,
Yeah,
in
King James, I have King James.
okay.
It's not capitalized.
Okay.
God.
So in verse 5 it says, God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be open and you will be like God, in the New Revised Standard Version. In the King James Version it says gods. And also you'll remember at the very beginning there's a lot of we language, there's gods, our, there's a lot of plural. And that is because this is English's attempt in different ways to reconcile with the fact that the Hebrew word there is plural, Elohim. And so there are ways that people have understood that. One is that God is using the royal we, and then another way is that what's being referred to is sort of the heavenly court, that God and all of the little g gods, angels, what have you, are all speaking, or the serpent is referring to all of them. But ultimately, we can't exactly know what the first authors of this scripture intended. All we know is what word they used, which was a plural word. Yeah.
It does say that King James, and as far as what they made of the fig leaves,
Yeah.
it says aprons. Aprons.
Aprons. Okay.
And
Interesting.
this, yeah, and here it's loincloths.
Which I
This is
suppose
a
is
way-
the same thing.
Isn't this
In
a
a
way to, in reality, as Christianity evolved and people evolved, that the writers had to deal with the consolidation of all of these other gods, because they want to make sure that this God that they're talking about is God over everybody. But everybody else, I mean, a lot of people were worshiping the sun.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people were worshiping something else,
Mm-hmm.
the sun primarily.
Mm-hmm.
And how did we get from something that was much more tangential or tangible to something that is very abstract?
Yeah, it's a good question. In the ancient world, the question was sort of how do we go from polytheism to monotheism in a way? And in the ancient world, most other peoples did hold polytheistic beliefs, the belief in more than one God. And so the Israelites were unique in the ancient world. However, a lot of people believe that they actually weren't strictly monotheistic, that there were lots of Israelites who sort of dabbled in other religions, which was really common in the ancient world. And today,
Unlike today.
yeah, kind of like today. where basically people look for whatever we can find that'll help us make sense of the world, or a good enough advocate to help us get through the world. And so how we move from um, gods that are oriented around the natural world to a more abstracted God is a good question. But the way that God is often referred to in the Hebrew scriptures is as a parent. So there are some places though where God is referred to as the great I am. For instance, Moses asks God about God, and God refers to um, God's self as the great I am, which is in fact the kind of strict translation of the name Yahweh, which is the Hebrew verb for to be. And so, the way we make that journey is kind of long and convoluted, but it's actually going to circle us back to a conversation about Satan, in fact. Because so let's put a bookmark on that question for just a minute. Because if we take a look at what's not in this text, the word Satan does not appear. Also, if you notice, the word sin does not appear. The word sin, in fact, doesn't appear anywhere in the creation story, even when God is chastising them for having gone against God's command. God says, "Because you have done this to the serpent, cursed are you among all animals." And then to the woman, God said, "I will make your pangs in childbirth exceedingly great." And to the man, he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife," and so on. God doesn't actually use the word sin, nor do the authors. So how do we get there? How do we get from, I think, if you went to a Sunday school, likely some of what you heard had to do with the serpent being Satan, and that this is about the beginning of sin. So how do we get there? So let's look at firstly the question of how we get from serpent to Satan. So these are two paintings that kind of give you a sense. It might be a little hard on Zoom, y'all. I'm sorry, but on the left side we have a creature in the tree that's kind of has a branch in its mouth with a few fruit on it, and it's kind of passing that fruit off to Eve. And then on the right, we have Eve reaching up and maybe picking a fruit with this serpent-like thing that on the top part has a male body with horns, pretty clearly the devil. So in the ancient understanding, the serpent was just an animal, because in fact, in the ancient Israelite world, there was no concept of the devil, or capital S, Satan. The word Satan is actually a Hebrew word that just means accuser or adversary. And it almost always appears in the Hebrew scriptures as ha-Satan, which literally means the Satan, the accuser, the adversary, and only appears like 4 or 5 times in the entire Old Testament. One of the most famous places that it appears is in the book of Job, and it's actually ha-Satan that sets off the entire book, because here's how the story goes. One day, the heavenly beings, here we are again with Elohim, so that could have been translated as gods or God, came to present themselves before the Lord and the accuser. In some translations, it just says Satan also came among them. The Lord said to the accuser, "Where have you come from?" The accuser answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to the accuser, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Then the accuser answered the Lord, Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. So, here in the first chapter of the book of Job, Job is this very righteous, very upstanding citizen of Israel, and God is very proud of Job. Then Hasatan comes, the accuser comes and says he's only doing that because he's got it all. You take all that away from him, he will curse you to your face. And that sets off the rest of the story, right? Because God kills all of Job's family, takes all of his possessions away, and Job's trying to figure out what in the world has happened to me, and he goes to his friends and all of this, and it's all set off because of Ha-Satan. And so, when I was first reading and learning about this, I then wondered if the term devil's advocate comes from this, and it doesn't. Not directly. The term devil's advocate actually comes from the Catholic Church. In the process of canonization, there would be one person who is saying, Joy should become a saint because she's so great and she's done all this. And then the devil's advocate would say, no, she shouldn't, because she was mean to me this one time and she cut me off in the grocery store line and all of these sorts of things. And so that would be, in a way, similar to this, where, again, the moments in the Hebrew scriptures where Hasatan shows up is very often when someone's being celebrated, and then the accuser, the adversary, says, they ain't all that, actually. And so, how do we move from that to this, to that version of Satan? Well, it takes hundreds of years, actually. And so by the time we get to the New Testament, we have a really different view of Satan. Now Satan is not just an accuser, but is evil. And now Satan is not just a role, but is in fact a being. And so part of what happens there is throughout Israelite history, as that group of people is held captive by the Persians after Jerusalem is destroyed, and then later are conquered by the Greeks. These are two groups of people who have a really different view of cosmology. And part of what is in that view is this polytheistic sense that there is an ultimate good and an ultimate evil, which was foreign to Israelites in their monotheistic views. And so for the Israelites, there was one God. And even in Christianity, that we continue to say that. But I think if you grew up with a really strong sense of Satan as this other thing, this other being that could whisper things to you, and the devil made me do it, that sort of a thing, Satan actually assumes a whole lot of power. And part of the story is that Satan was an angel that fell from grace, and then famously says, according to the poet John Milton, it's better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. And so all of this is to say that we could do a whole thing on the devil, a whole Bible study just on Satan. But what I'll say now is that
where the devil is busy?
That's where the devil's busy. That's right. But our ideas about Satan have really mostly come from, in the ancient world, it was from other cultures. And even today, it's from literary history. It's from a whole variety of sources, actually outside of the Bible. Yeah, Colin.
Sounds like the devil was created by society.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to think about. Carl was saying it sounds like the devil was created by society. Well, I think that in these different worldviews where there's a duality, where there's two poles, if there's an ultimate good, then logic would dictate that there's an ultimate bad. And so if there's a God who's in charge of the ultimate good, then there's probably a God who's in charge of the ultimate bad. And so that's partly how we get to these two warring factions. And in Revelations, we get more of a sense of that. The devil is talked about. We get a war in Revelations. And so, as we think about, why would, how is it that people came to this? One answer is that it was revealed to people, and it's the truth. This is how cosmology works. This is the world we live in. Another answer that folks have moved towards is a more psychological, sociological metaphor, that these are all metaphors for powers and realities that are working inside us. So it's a great question, where does the devil come from? And then how does the devil function in society? Because the devil looks all kinds of ways too. And it all depends on what time period you're in and all the rest of it. Any other questions or thoughts about this movement from a serpent to Satan?
There are people who think concept,
Absolutely.
and I think there's probably a pretty strong evidence talking out to because, but the whole idea that we needed when we became aware that we were in this universe that was just so bright, so empty, whatever it was, and our brains at that particular point couldn't figure it out. So we needed to find a rock. We needed to find justification for why we're here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. People have certainly thought that God as a concept is something that humans just came up with in order to find a way to reconcile with the fact that we exist along with everything else. Another way people have done that is to suggest that God exists, but the way God exists is totally colored by culture, by gender, by time period, by language, all of those sorts of things. And then, of course, the other end of the spectrum is that God exists in exactly the way the King James Version of the Bible says that God exists. And that's the end of the story. And so, again, we're invited at every one of those junctures. But what we're really invited to do here is to think about, well, how might these stories have meaning for us now in one way, shape, or form? Aaron, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was just curious. What are the time periods of those paintings?
Yeah, thanks. This one on the left is by an Italian artist and working in the Renaissance. And the one on the right, I think, is from like a kid's book from the 1970s.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
So then she hasn't eaten the apple yet. She's sure covered up.
Yeah, that's so I'm assuming that this is, I mean, obviously I just found this on the internet, but I'm pretty sure it came from like a children's illustrated Bible. So they took special pains to cover her up with a bush and her hair and all of that. And on this side, she's, I mean, it's just her body is covering up parts of her body. But then,
She's eating the second apple.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we're also seeing how certain time periods comfort even with nakedness is coming through. If you just look up temptation of Adam and Eve, you'll see all kinds of ways that artists have depicted their bodies. if you're looking particularly in the Renaissance, the Christian Renaissance, what you won't almost certainly won't see are Adam's genitals, for instance. There's something covering them. It's not. It doesn't look as if he's done it on purpose. There just happens to be like a cow head there, or something else.
You
Well,
know the way I see this?
hmm,
It's just personal. I see it as a way to control people's actions. The story.
yeah. You want to say a little bit more about what kind of control or how?
Well, because if you do the wrong things, this is going to happen. And, you know, you have to obey. You have to, you know, and then they blame each other and stuff like that. But I see it's society saying, this is what's going to happen if you disobey.
Mm, mm,
Even though it doesn't say sin, it still points to the fact that it's going to be punishment.
mm.
That's just the way I see it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, it's interesting. Joy was saying that this feels like a text that is in the service of controlling people, and that it may not use the word sin, but it's clear that there's punishment here. You know, another way that folks have looked at this is that beyond punishment, that what we're reading here are cosmic consequences. So, for instance, if you walk off a ledge, you'll fall. Not because you're being punished, but because that's just what happens. And the way some folks have read this is that eating that fruit of the knowledge of good and evil and having your eyes opened in this way, this is just what happened. That they, Adam and Eve, then were the reaction, the consequence was suddenly feeling shame in a way that they hadn't before.
And pain.
And pain. Yeah.
You know, women in childbirth.
Absolutely.
Things like that. But that, to me, is a natural thing.
Yeah.
But they are blaming this.
Right. And this relates a little bit to that conversation we had about origin stories and how part of what they do sometimes is to help people understand mysteries. Why is it so painful to give birth for women? Why is it so difficult to grow food from the earth? This story offers an answer for that. And whether or not it's a satisfying answer is a whole other question. But this group of people, this culture said, here are answers we're going to give because of what human beings did. It was a consequence of punishment for what human beings did. Let's think about sin, though. So according to y'all's reading of this, what was the sin? What was the sin that Adam and Eve committed? If we want to think about this in terms of a sin. Do you have a sense of that?
Knowing that they know better.
Knowing that they know better and choosing to do something against God's command. What might be a word for that?
Disobedience.
Disobedience. Okay. And if we think about what pushes a person to disobey, I'm really just thinking out loud with y'all. Temptation. Yeah.
Their ego.
You can be ego, pride. I know better. What's that, Carolyn? Selfishness. Lack of self-control. What did you say, Carolyn? Yeah, disagreeing. Thinking you know better. Which seems to be what the serpent's saying here, right? You're not going to die. Don't even worry about that. Okay, so these seem like all good, reasonable sins. Pride, thinking you know better. Well, according to much of traditional Christendom, the sin that they describe as taking place here is this kind of a long word, concupiscence.
Wondered how it's pronounced.
Did you see the word in there?
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, you heard it?
I've heard that, seen that we're gonna.
Yeah, concupiscence. And so it's kind of a strangely long word, but what it means essentially is very intense desire. And so, what um, a large number of Christian philosophers and theologians have said went wrong here is that Adam and Eve were overwhelmed by fleshly desire, basically. And the way they um, reconcile that, or one of the ways they get to that, is the nakedness. Is that some folks believe that not only were they naked, but they actually had sex. And that was a not okay thing for them to do. And so you remember last week we talked about the Shakers. And one of the ways that the Shakers understood this story was that in the pre-fall Eden, in the Garden of Eden before this moment, there was no sex. And so in their attempts to recreate that garden corruption of creation, they also wouldn't have sex. Men died out.
Where does this, be something and multiply?
Be fruitful and multiply.
Creation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, I think the way folks would answer that question is that that really pertained to Adam and Eve's relationship to the garden, not with each other. And so, the idea being that there maybe wouldn't have been other humans if everything had just sort of stayed in this harmony with the garden and Adam and Eve, and they're walking with God, and they're just living forever in harmony. Which sounds really boring, according to some. And so this idea of concupiscence, some have understood it as fleshly desire for sex. Some have others and lust, which is often how this word makes its way into English. Because concupiscence doesn't really show up a ton in the Bible. What you're more likely to see is the word lust, or in some places the word gluttony, because there's this sense of this overwhelming desire for food is what actually was going on here. So just unhealthy, intense desire, sinful desire. And so in the Augsburg Confession, which was written by Martin Luther and some other reformers, here's what they say. It is taught among us that since the fall of Adam, all men who are born according to the course of nature are conceived and born in sin. That is, all men are full of evil lust and inclinations from their mother's wombs and are unable by nature to have true fear of God and true faith in God. And so we are corrupted in our nature, according to the Augsburg Confession, with evil lust and inclinations. And so if you look at these two paintings of the temptation of Adam and Eve, you notice that the tree and the snake is wrapped around the tree. So as these ideas begin to take more and more, make more and more of an impact on the Christian world, we then start to get pictures like this. Notice on the left, this is a painting by William Blake in the 18th century. And then on the right, this is a picture by an Italian artist in a similar time. What are you noticing here?
Even the snake connected to both.
Yeah. Even the snake are not just near each other, they're touching. And on the left, in William Blake's painting, That snake is wrapped all the way around her body. Yeah.
Like people don't have to worry about anything.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and also in each of the depictions we've seen only white Adams and Eves. Yeah. Yeah, and on the right, you notice that it might be hard to see from where you're sitting, but the snake, which has wings, by the way, is almost licking Eve's cheek with its little forked tongue.
Well, and here they're sharing the fruit.
Yeah. And on the left, the snake is actually feeding Eve out of its own mouth. Yeah, so there's a whole other sense of sensuality here. And so, as we think about, these what this sin that's really at the heart of this story is, even those ideas have changed over time. Because what we're seeing here isn't just disobedience. We're seeing a whole other, kind of a sexual, sensual, erotic dimension to it as well.
Well, I think both of those paintings, in my mind, reinforce that it was the relationship between the snake or the serpent and Eve that caused the trouble. Yeah, I think that's reinforcement of that concept.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that at this time, and I mean, still, I'm sure in cultures around the world, um, there's a sense that it's women who are the more sexual of the two genders. That it's women, part of hysteria, that word that was used and still used to describe states, particularly that women could be in, was very often associated with hypersexuality. That women who were hysterical were hypersexual. And it's partly why, depending on your politics, female genital mutilation or female circumcision are still practiced in places, which, for those who may not know, is the removal of the clitoris. It's control, right? In one way.
Pastor, in the picture there on the right, we see the serpent, but isn't that a dove at the bottom of the foot?
Yeah, it looks to be.
So here we see that in the Garden of the Garden of Eden, that people, they're showing harmony.
And
No, that
Yeah, but that dove looks dead.
that's what I'm trying to say.
yeah, it does look dead to me too. Yeah, because it looks like its feet
So
are
why
up.
would it be dead?
It's a good question. The way I've kind of read that is that the snake killed it, and that the snake, that the serpent maybe poisoned it. And if we think of doves as kind of a symbol of peace and harmony,
What is there? What is the red piece below it? The little red that I can't see. What is that? The little red.
oh, here
Yeah.
it looks kind of like flowers or berries to me, like it's just part of the river.
That the bird ate up the apple and died.
Maybe
Of the tree.
could be.
Something.
Yeah,
It just
yeah,
appeared that was a dove or some kind of pigeon.
yeah, yeah. I think it's a dove as well. Yeah, and it looks to me like it's dead too. So these, like we talked about in a previous session, we look at these paintings. They very often have sort of key symbols to help the viewer figure out what's going on. And so I suspect that even without my telling you or you reading the titles of these paintings, if you saw them, you'd have a pretty clear sense of what's going on. Because pretty much all the pieces are there that you would need: a naked body, fruit, tree, serpent. And so the rest are liberties that these artists have taken that reflect their own interpretations of what's happening and what happened.
I don't want to get carried away on this, but that that dove could also represent
Interesting. Yeah, Adam's not in this painting, is he? What makes you wonder about that, Sonia?
Well, I mean, we have responded that this is a dead bird,
Yeah.
and in order for the snake to reign in this or be dominant, that energy, there's the snake, caressing her ear and whispering, making some sound,
Mm-hmm.
and Adam got bumped out the picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, if you're
here,
going to say it was the Eve and if you subscribe to the theory, it's Eve and the serpent who created this evil.
Right.
Even in this other picture, Adam's back is to what's going on over here. It's a little, he's in the picture but dead.
It's
Yes.
all naive.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Well, and you could it has been used to justify subjugating women. That it was women's fault, which is partly what we actually read in the scripture.
Mhm.
And then what we see here is that women are more easily tempted than a man would be. That a man, while he's looking up and pondering, Eve's over here focused on eating this fruit out of the snake's mouth. Yeah, in this depiction, we don't even we don't even get to the point at which Adam is also guilty. In other paintings, you see that. You see Adam receiving the fruit from Eve and what have you, but not this one. Well, thinking about another way to describe sin and the sin that's happening here. I just want to take a quick moment because I'm sure, particularly if you grew up Catholic or if you grew up in a tradition that subscribes to certain traditional doctrines, you've heard of original sin. And the idea is that there's this kind of dichotomy. Thinking about sin as something that we do, and thinking of sin as something that we have. So there was in the second century, there was one of the very first Christian writers to write about Genesis, says that the Christ has suffered to be crucified for the race of men who, since Adam, were fallen to the power of death and were in the error of the serpent, each man committing evil by his own fault. And so for this writer, Justin Martyr, sin was something that everyone does. Sin was something that Adam was just the first. But there was another idea in the Christian world at this time, which was that sin was something that people inherited. And this is where the concept of original sin comes in. And so in this time, in the second century, there was a Christian writer named Tertullian who was considered to be the first person actually to suggest that sin was inheritable. And so he believed in this concept called traducianism, which was the idea that every human soul is derived from the souls of their parents. And so, if you take that on all the way back, that would mean that because everyone's parents, if you go far enough back, you land with Adam and Eve, because of their sin and the way it corrupted their souls, that corruption has made its way into every human soul. And so here's what then eventually leads to debates about infant baptism. There are some Christians who believe you should not baptize a baby because they can't understand what baptism means. And this is an idea that sin is something that individuals commit. And so you have to be conscious, aware, morally thoughtful in order to do that. Yeah.
Did not, Pastor. My mother did not baptize us as babies. said that it's a choice, you know, when you're 12 years old, then you can make that choice whether you want to be in her faith, you know, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm like, actually, I did not get baptized till I was 26,
Yeah.
you know.
And that was in fact the way from all the evidence we have, what the earliest Christians did was that they did not baptize babies, they baptized adults. It was only a few hundred years later where some of these concepts started to come into play, where baptizing babies was thought of as a necessary part of washing their souls of the original sin, so that a person could start fresh in the world. And so that's partly what that whole debate that still people have today. Should you baptize babies? Shouldn't you? It's part of why it's still alive today, because people have different ideas about what sin is and how it lives in us.
How old was Jesus when he was baptized?
Okay, well, we know where you fall on this debate. Yeah.
And why did the church institute infant baptism?
Yeah, it became more of a practice after this
A
idea.
financial
Oh, because people would pay to have their babies baptized. Yeah. Hmm.
I grew up in the Lutheran church. I mean, my mom was Baptist, but my father was Lutheran, so we went to a Lutheran church, but they did infant baptism.
Hmm. Yeah.
But I didn't get baptized until, I mean, I remember as an adult, I went to a church out in Colorado Springs, Fort Carson, and I got baptized again as an adult.
Mm.
But as a child, I don't remember.
Yeah. Yeah.
Paul and I were watching a very interesting show, taking a scientific spin. I don't know where this really, I guess it's our minds that would take us from when say it's sin, but when women give birth now, they're able to trace DNA from the mother through the child, through the next generation. That DNA is there.
Yeah.
They haven't said have been able to locate it as the father.
Right. Because of the chromosomes,
Yeah.
right? Because of the X chromosomes. Yeah. Pan was just saying that they've found ways to trace the DNA lineage in any person through the maternal lineage through X chromosomes. Everyone has X chromosomes. Not everyone has Y chromosomes.
Right.
And so you can trace a whole maternal lineage that way. And so, this idea of the inheritability of souls, it's interesting because there's ways that we talk about it with different language. I mean, Tertullian, he was not thinking about DNA or genetics. But there are certain tendencies, even now, that we think of as inheritable. We think of certain addictions as inheritable. We think of certain illnesses as inheritable. Um, we think of all kinds of things that our parents, our families did as showing up in our lives, whether we like it or not. And so it's not hard really to see a more metaphorical or allegorical way of interpreting this in that way, thinking about what your family's original sin is, or what sin you have inherited. If you think about sin in that way, not necessarily as some sort of moral stain, but as a tendency to move in a direction that doesn't serve you in some kind of way. And so these battles, these debates continue to rage and in many ways provoked whole new denominations. The Baptists, that's kind of one of their main focal points, is that people make choices to be baptized. You don't baptize someone without their consent, without their choosing it. And again, and particularly the Catholic Church in some of the in the Episcopal Church. There are other lots of churches, denominations where babies are baptized still. So we've thought about this question of sin as something we do versus something that we have or inherit. And we've also talked about sin as disobedience, sin as this intense desire. I'm going to now talk a little bit more about a really different way of interpreting this story, of interpreting the fall, and that is a more kind of um, literary or psychological way of understanding the story. And so, if we think about the tree that Adam and Eve were told not to eat of, it was a very specific tree. It was the tree of what?
Like,
Not life, actually. The tree of life was another one. God eventually says, we need to kick them out of here, or else they eat of that. But the tree that God explicitly said don't eat of was the tree of knowledge, not just knowledge in general, knowledge of good and evil. And so the way some people have seen what this story is really about is how, again, this is taking sort of a more developmental approach, but thinking about how that moment split the world into an arrangement of moral opposites. And so, if we again go with this reading of Adam and Eve as children, the process of maturation sometimes leads people to split the world into good and bad, right and wrong. So, Joseph Campbell, whom we mentioned a few sessions ago, had this to say about this moment in Genesis. The Garden of Eden, where there is no time, and where men and women don't even know that they are different from one another. They're just creatures. And God and humans are practically the same. They walk together in the cool of the evening in the Garden of Eden together, and then they eat the apple from the tree of knowledge, which makes them aware of opposites. And the man and woman cover their shame. Suddenly they're different. God and human are now different. Nature is against human, all duality. And so, for Joseph Campbell and other folks, what's actually happened in this moment is that a world that was harmonious and balanced and unified is suddenly split and separated into opposites, good and bad, God and human, spirit and body, humans and nature. Are there other dualities or separations that y'all see in the text? Yeah, Miss Marcia. Oh, looks like you're still muted, Marcia.
Okay. Um, it does seem as though the major dichotomy, male and female, predates the eating of the fruit of the tree.
Yeah, that's interesting that you name that because in the first chapter of Genesis, we get God saying that God's creating male and female,
Mhm.
both in God's image. And then in the second chapter of Genesis, we get this other story where God creates Adam, wants a companion, creates all the animals, no suitable companion. Then God makes a companion by taking the rib and what have you. And so Adam and Eve are referred to as man and woman, but I think what this is suggesting was that there was no difference between them, no substantive difference in terms of their responsibilities, their work, maybe their bodies, although there are some ancient Christian readers of this story who say that what actually happened when it says that they put on clothes was that they put on skins, like human skin, that they were disembodied spirits kind of in the world before, and then after the fall, they assumed bodies. Um, and so, yeah, but they're definitely different. There's definitely a sense that they're different. But are they opposite? That doesn't seem to be the case. And is there a moral judgment that one is better than the other? That doesn't seem to be the case necessarily before the fall. But after the fall, God assigns different consequences for their actions. And and one of the things that we notice right off the bat is now suddenly we have this duality between naked and clothed. Whereas before, that didn't exist. No one cared about that. And so we're having this whole split taking place. And it's not just a split, but it's a split with moral judgments. That when there are two different things that are seemingly opposite, they fall into categories. One's good, one's bad, or at least one's better than the other. And so, well, before we move on, any questions or other thoughts about that way of reading this?
Why did they bother to include the two stories?
Yeah, so Carl's asking about the two different stories about the about creation. Well, the way that folks have answered that question is really it's on a variety of different kind of theological backgrounds. If you read the Bible literally, and from cover to cover, as folks like to say, one way that people reconcile that is that this was the second story in Genesis chapter 2 was just an elaboration on the first story. So it was just the way authors sometimes do, they offer more explanation. Another way that people have um, read this is what's called the documentary hypothesis, which is the idea that Genesis is made up of more than one piece of paper, more than one document, that were just sort of edited together. And so what the editors did was include both stories. And they've actually assigned authorship to the different people. Because if you look at Genesis chapter 1 through the very beginning of chapter 2, you don't see the word Yahweh used at all. God is referred to as Elohim. But then in chapter 2 on, through the end of chapter 3, God is referred to as Yahweh. So every time you heard me read or you read yourself the word Lord in all caps, that's actually a translation of the Hebrew word Yahweh. And so what other folks believe is that, which was very common in the ancient world, is that these folks just edited together various stories to kind of make them flow one into the other and just let it be. Yeah, Miss Marcia.
Now, I don't remember how developmentally how much uh, Joseph Campbell listened to children, but dichotomous thinking is, I believe, schooled. That is, I don't think little children, by virtue of natural growing up, come to think in dichotomies. I think they get that by explicit instruction. We instruct them in opposites. We teach that. And I mean, categorical thinking, I think, comes naturally. That is, as children and all human languages do that categorizing. But I don't think dichotomies are part of the natural course of human development.
Yeah, you saying that, Marcia, actually is a great segue into a clip that I'm going to pause in just a moment to bring up, a TED Talk. I suspect that some of you may have seen it. It's by Sir Ken Robinson, and he's talking about creativity. and he kind of comes to the exact same conclusion that you're naming here. Before we get there, though, thinking about the unnaturalness of dualistic thinking, or this dichotomous thinking. If we think back to the very beginning of the story, when God creates humans in the first chapter, God says that God makes male and female in God's own image. And so the idea is that we share something substantial with God. And so one of the questions we might ask is, what does that mean? What does that look like? And so I'll ask you all that. As you think about what it means to be made in God's image, what does that mean to you? What does that, how does that shape you?
Metaphorically, with infinite possibility.
What you say?
I think metaphorically, with infinite possibility.
With infinite possibility. Yeah. Because God has infinite possibility. What about other folks? What does it mean to you to be made in God's image?
Well, I'm wondering if that's God's spiritual image, because we have, on the other hand, in the New Testament, that God is neither male nor female. So I'm not too sure it's about physical image,
Yeah.
but a spiritual image, the wholeness, however we experience, interpret, know God spiritually.
Yeah, I think we get into trouble when we start thinking in terms of images. If more much more abstract spiritual part rings true with me. And that's when I talked earlier about people actually creating God in their image. It seems to make sense to me, but at the same time, I'm really attracted to what you said. When you talk about spiritually, about the soul, then no image comes to mind.
Well, we're also told that Jesus was both human and divine, and we are told that we can claim that as our identity as well. So that's the closest I could come to thinking, interpreting that as in the image of God, that God is created, comes, is presented as both human and divine, and that we can be and are called to be in this life.
I think isn't there a large group of people who just don't have that kind of confidence?
Oh, yeah.
That they feel like they're less than and they couldn't possibly be divine. I mean, that's problematic, but I'm afraid a lot of people think that.
Well, depending on your school of thought, that's part of our problem. We don't know what we are.
Mm.
We don't know our capacity,
Mm.
and don't exercise that. We
find the
operate
idea
out.
of-
We operate out of the human, which in my mind is like the lower it's the denominator rather than the higher part of the universe.
Somewhere in my adult life, I came on the idea, or I started or listening to and gaining. I felt like I got permission to inherit that divinity, and it was a very liberating feeling.
You know, it's interesting as we're talking about this, because I think, and I don't know that necessarily y'all were meaning it in these ways, but, or any of us, when we think about the human and the divine, there's a separation,
Mhm.
right? There's a pair of dichotomies, binaries. And I think often people assign moral value to them. One's better than the other. And, part of what we see in the theology around Jesus was the way it develops over time is that people worked really hard to try to figure out how do we make sense of this? In the New Testament, there's lots of moments where the flesh is talked about as being lower than the spirit. And so, as we think about what it means to be made in God's image, is that just govern the spiritual part of us, or does it have something to do with the human part of us too, or the physical part of us? We don't know exactly. We're all invited to make sense of that or meaning out of it in our own ways. But one of the things that I'll invite you to think about as we start nearing towards a close for tonight is being made in God's image, to my mind at least, has some bearing on what we do. If we think about what God does, being made in God's image might have some bearing on what we do. And one of the primary things that God does is create. That's what the very first thing is that God does, right? God creates. And so thinking about our capacity, human beings' capacity to create, is one of the things that separates us in some senses from other animals. What we create, how we create, the fact that we create in various levels of complexity, and the fact that we create together. Other animals do that in their own ways, not necessarily at the scale that human beings do. And so let's think about creativity. What it is. How do we tap into that? Because I'm sure all of us has probably had a moment or two where like, I don't feel like I'm a creative person. Maybe that's something we have in our heads. Or we don't think we've gotten to a moment where like, I guess I could be creative, but I don't even know how to. I don't even know what that looks like. And so Ken Robinson, he's an educator, a writer. This TED Talk that you're about to see a little clip from is one of the most watched TED Talks on the internet. It's had over 24 million views. And so we're going to watch just a little bit of a clip because part of what he's going to talk to us about is how and why creativity fails. Fails to happen. Ken Robinson, Ken Robinson. Okay, here we go.
So, 15 minutes left. Well, I was born. No, I had a great story recently. I love telling it, of a little girl who was in a drawing lesson. She was 6 and she was at the back drawing, and the teacher said, this little girl hardly ever paid attention. And in this drawing lesson, she did. And the teacher was fascinated. She went over to her and she said, what are you drawing? And the girl said, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher said, but nobody knows what God looks like. And the girl said, they will in a minute. When my son was 4 in England, actually he was 4 everywhere, to be honest. I mean, for being strict about it, wherever he went, he was 4 here. But he was in the Nativity play. Do you remember the story? No, it's big. It's a big story. Mel Gibson did the sequel. You may have seen it. Nativity 2. But James got the part of Joseph, which we were thrilled about. We consider this to be one of the lead parts. We had the place crammed full of agents and T-shirts. James Robinson is Joseph over here. He didn't have to speak, but do you know the bit where the 3 kings come in? They come in bearing gifts, and they bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This really happened. We're sitting there, and they, I think, just went out of sequence. Because we talked to the little boy afterwards and said, are you okay with that? And they said, yeah, why was that wrong? They just switched, I think that was it. Anyway, the three boys came in, little 4-year-olds with tea towels on their heads, and they put these boxes down, and the first boy said, I bring you gold. And the second boy said, I bring you myrrh. And the third boy said, Frank sent this. What these things have in common is that kids will take a chance. If they don't know, they'll have a go. Am I right? They're not frightened of being wrong. Now, I don't mean to say that being wrong is the same thing as being creative. What we do know is, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. If you're not prepared to be wrong. And by the time they get to be adults, most kids have lost that capacity. They have become frightened of being wrong. And we run our companies this, by the way. We stigmatize mistakes. And we're now running national education systems where mistakes are the worst thing you can make. And the result is that we are educating people out of their creative capacities. Picasso once said this. He said that all children are born artists. The problem is to remain an artist as we grow up. I believe this passionately that we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it. Or rather, we get educated out of it. So why is this? I lived in Stratford-on-Avon until about 5 years ago. In fact, we moved from Stratford to Los Angeles.
Oh.
So you can imagine what a seamless transition.
Yeah, he's going into a whole riff on Los Angeles right now. But that was what the piece there about being wrong. I heard some mms and yeses as we listened to that. What reflections? Did any of you identify with what he was saying about creativity and the fear of being wrong?
The fear of being wrong is the same as fear of failure.
I think so. I think so, because in a culture that, again, if we're staying with this idea of part of the fall, part of the move from creation being the world getting split into two, into opposites, into a duality, success and failure, right? And then if we think about them getting assigned a moral value, we know which one's good and which one's bad, right and wrong. Again, we know which one's good and which one's bad. And so if we live in a world that is split like that, his suggestion is that it's going to be a really uncreative world because we're going to constantly avoid failing, being wrong, being bad.
But they tell us that we learn from failure.
That's the idea, I think, for sure, that we can learn from failure, is what Fran did.
So we shouldn't make that as bad.
Yeah.
So I hear so many people who are successful tell you what, how many times they fail.
How many times they failed.
Because you only see the success.
Right.
I had something that opened my eyes up this year. I'm taking this class with Elaine Blanchard. And the ending of it, you're making a collage. And I was saying to my son, who's a bit of an artist, that I was really concerned about not doing it right, and because he's very creative, and I don't think myself as creative. And he said, Mom, that's the great thing about creativity. There's no wrong to it. Just do what you're feeling, and it will be right. And don't let someone else determine for you that it's wrong, but you're determining what's wrong. So you're already stepping out in not a great place. So I've been trying to let that. I was running late today because I was trying to work on it. And I was caught up in trying to get it right, and I was hearing what he said. It's like, just let it flow, and that opened up quite a bit.
Yeah, thanks for that, Karen.
But creativity comes in many different forms.
It does. That's right.
Not just paintings or making a dress or whatever. I mean, growing plants. I mean, that's being creative. I mean, there's so many different ways we can use our gifts to create.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know?
Creativity looks all kinds of ways, Joy's saying, not just artistic, but there's all kinds of ways that we can be creative problem solvers. We can, in terms of just the way we live our lives, be creative. Yeah, Carl, what were you thinking?
Well, I struggle with it every day because I'm concerned about what somebody else thinks about my work,
Mm-hmm.
and that is enemy number one as far as I'm concerned. I've succeeded a couple of times, being able to get past that moment when actually the paint hits the paper, and I'm just interested in that moment. I'm not interested in what it looks like, but that moment is precious.
Mm.
And that's my goal, is to get back to that moment.
Yeah.
So it's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you
Just
think someone took that away from you?
Well, I had a very successful creative father, so that's a long story.
Yeah, I was
But
going
it took a while to get out from under that tree.
Right.
there you go. Well, and Carl was just naming that there's this what can stifle creativity is this sense of other people's opinion, which is a little bit what you were naming too, Carolyn, wanting to do it right, and it's other people's opinion saying that it's bad. I assume, right? That and so I'm going to give you just a quick definition of creativity as we wrap up from Psychology Today. And this is really, they're describing creative people and what creative people do. Creative people embody complexity. They show tendencies of thought and action that are segregated in others. They balance intense energy with quiet rest, playfulness with discipline, fantasy with reality, and passion for their work with objectivity. And so here we have a whole series of dualities that are getting reconciled, are complexified in creative people, according to Psychology Today. And that another way that they've looked at this with neuroscience is that the brain has at least 3 different systems that in most people operate individually. But among creative people, they can operate at times at least simultaneously. So connections get made in ways that can't if we're only using one process at a time. And so one of the suggestions, and we'll end with this, one of the suggestions that folks have made around how to get out of a creative rut or to increase creativity is actually to be fruitful and multiply, to just produce, just keep making. And then some of it will be less than good. And then some of it will be really good. And you won't know, though, you won't be focused on that because you'll be focused on just producing. So that's one of several strategies that people have come up with, psychologists have come up with to help people get out of that kind of judgment, that kind of worry about doing it right or wrong. Just make, just create, and let the rest go.
Pastor, I have a very funny story before we go.
Yeah.
Kennedy's 4 years old, and she's at the Baptist church, and it's Easter time. They gave her a speech. We're all there, waiting for her to speech. And she gets up there, and she says this lovely little speech about, Jesus died on the cross for us. The lady who comes over there comes back to us after everything's over. She said, "That's not what we want." She had made a whole speech of our own.
Oh my
And we were like,
gosh.
what? And we said, Kennedy, why didn't you say what you were taught? I didn't want to say that.
Wasn't mine.
Fran was just relaying a story about her niece saying being invited to give a speech at the Easter service, and she just was given a script to read and memorize and report, and she didn't use it. She just made up something that she wanted to say about Easter.
And we were all like, yay!
Oh.
Like this. And the lady, she said, we didn't teach her that.
Oh my God.
I want to tell everybody here, because I like to cook.
Match made in heaven.
But when the dog won't even eat it, that was a mistake.
That was a creativity.
See, yeah, all kinds of ways to be creative.
You lost me.
Yeah. Well, y'all, thank you so much for being here today. Next Wednesday is our last session for this series. The next series that we're going to do is going to be based on the book Who Stole My Bible by Jennifer Butler. And so it's going to be really helpful to have that book with you. If you don't get it, that's okay. There'll be lots to discuss even without the book, but I encourage you to get it if you'd like to take part in that. It'll start on October 29th and it'll go until November 19th. And this is a book that is about the Bible as a resource for resisting tyranny. And it looks specifically at the ways that the evangelical right in particular have interpreted and used the Bible for tyrannical ends. And her contention is that, in fact, the Bible is a tool of resistance in and of itself. And so we talked a little bit about Jennifer Butler in a few sessions ago when we were talking about origin stories and the way she reads this story as, in fact, a nonviolent resistance story. Whereas most of the other origin stories in the ancient world are about gods killing each other and the universe springing out of their corpses and blood. She's saying it was actually an act of resistance to create an origin story that was not about death and war and blood. So that'll be the topic for our next Bible study. If you want to buy it in person, it will not be possible unless you order it. So I looked everywhere that I could find, local bookstores, the chain bookstores. So I was able to order it though from Burke's bookstore right down the street on Cooper, and it came in like 5 days. So if you'd like to get it, I encourage you to reach out to the people at Burke's, and you should be able to get it pretty easily. All right, y'all. Thank you so much.
Give you a discount. She's a member of this
Yeah.
church.
Yeah, Cheryl's a member of the church.
Sometimes
It could
they
be.
do that.
Yeah,
Yeah. So if you
a group order. Okay. Y'all, thank you so much, folks online. Great to see you and be with you. Take care.
You know,